Hello there. This is the first of a 13-lecture series on how we got our Bible. Much of its substance is owed to David Ewart's excellent book, A General Introduction to the Bible, From Ancient Tablets to Modern Translations. I'm grateful to Zondervan Publications for permitting me to draw on it for this series. Any errors are, to be sure, entirely my own. We begin, of course, with the Bible and its earliest origins. First of all, we will require something to write on, and that takes us to Egypt and the papyrus plant. Foreigners sometimes call the plant biblos, essentially a tall stalk topped with delicate fronds. It is a natural choice for fanning or brushing away annoying insects. We see it in that kind of use on wall paintings like this one, where an attendant is providing for the comfort of the pharaoh on his barge. The plants are also visible along shore, and some parts are in the water as well. Very early on, the Egyptians found how to use the plant in writing. You can watch that process today if you visit the right souvenir shop. The lady splits the stalks lengthwise and soaks them, and then lays down several side by side. Then she sets down a second layer at right angles to the first. Now she can take up the roller and mallet and pound at the material until the plant fibers become thoroughly enmeshed. After drying, it looks like this: something to write on. If you glue the pages together, side by side, and roll them, you get the familiar scroll form. That was called either a biblion by the Greeks or a volumen by the Romans. That's from volvo, to roll, by the way. Eventually, in the 2nd or 3rd century A.D., they tried gluing just the left edges of the sheets together, with a result that looks familiar to us all. That was also called a biblion, but the Romans called it a codex. The newer format soon became the norm. Why the name biblos? For that question, we need a map. You see, papyrus grew most abundantly in Egypt, but it soon became a highly popular export item, and the most used port for transshipment was the Phoenician city of Byblos at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. Traders carried it from there all over, and often just referred to it by the name of its port of origin. You may already have gathered that the term biblion, meaning book, has come down to our language as Bible. After all, our culture has always considered it the book par excellence. If we peek between the covers of our Bibles, we see at once that they contain two testaments, Old and New. Where did we get that testament word? Well, properly we should be calling these parts covenants. The Hebrew word for covenant is berit, and the Greek term is diatheke. But the Latin word for covenant is testamentum, and that is what has become the source of our word testament. That's unfortunate, since we think of that word in connection with a death, as in last will and testament. But the term actually means a covenant or agreement. In the case of the two in our Bible, its reference is two covenants given by God to his people. The first was called in Latin Vetus Testamentum, Old Testament. Notice how the term is used in Scripture. When Moses had come down from Mount Sinai, having received instructions from God, he at once wrote them all down. And then we read, quote, "Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, 'We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey.' Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you, in accordance with all these words." Exodus 24, 7 and 8. Hence, the Vetus Testamentum, the Old Testament, containing the 10 Commandments and much more. It remained in force for 1,000 years, and then God told his prophet Jeremiah that one day it would be changed. "The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." Jeremiah 31, 31 through 33. Novum Testamentum, a New Testament, was on God's agenda, and that was, of course, the one to be initiated by Jesus. Recall what he told his disciples at the Last Supper. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." Luke 20:22. With his death, then, he would introduce a new covenant for his people. The author of Hebrews has much to say about this, such as here: "For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from their sins committed under the first covenant." Hebrews 9:15. And its relationship to the Old Covenant is made clear in a later passage. Quote, "By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear." Hebrews 8:13. 2 covenants, 2 testaments, 1 Bible. 1 Bible? And yet its table of contents tells us that it consists of numerous individual books, and a closer look reveals a remarkable diversity among them. The authors came from many lands: Palestine, Italy, Greece, Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and many walks of life. There were kings, courtiers, herdsmen, fishermen, priests, prophets, even a doctor, a rabbi, and a tax collector. And they produced a wide variety of literature: history, poetry, drama, law, prophecy, gospel, and correspondence. Yet despite all this diversity, their combined work has given us a single Bible with a grand overarching theme: a holy Creator God, who in his love and mercy is unfolding a mystic plan to save and bless eternally his erring children. Let's take a quick look at the books we find in the Old Testament. You may have learned in Sunday school, perhaps, that there are 39. Here they are. But is 39 the right count? Depends on how you count them. Many of the Jews would say there are 24. You see, they took 1st and 2nd Samuel as one book, 1st and 2nd Kings as one, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles as well. That's 3 less. Then they treated Ezra and Nehemiah as one, since both dealt with the rebuilding of the temple and Jerusalem's walls. And what we call the 12 minor prophets, they grouped together as one as well. 15 then from our 39. yielding 24. Same books, different count. And there's a further detail, because some told us that there were just 22. Josephus, a Jewish historian who was more or less a contemporary of Jesus, used that total. Here is how he justified it. Quote, "For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another, but only 22 books." He got this by including Ruth in with Judges and Lamentations in with Jeremiah, which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine, and of them 5 belong to Moses, which contain his laws and the traditions of the origin of mankind till his death. This interval of time was little short of 3,000 years. But as to the time from the death of Moses till the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, who reigned after Xerxes, the prophets who were after Moses wrote down what was done in their times in 13 books. Artaxerxes reigned in Persia from 465 to 424 BC, and the last of the prophets, Malachi, wrote in the late 400s. So, Josephus has sketched the entire period from Moses to Malachi, and told us about when the time of the prophets ended. To continue, the remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. It is true our history has been written since Artaxerxes, very particularly. Here he is referencing what we call the Old Testament Apocrypha, Maccabees, Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, and so forth. They were written in the main in the 2nd century BC. And notice what he says about these books as we continue the quote. "But has not been esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there has not been an exact succession of prophets since that time. And how firmly we have given credit to these books of our own nation is evident by what we do. For during so many ages as have already passed, no one has been so bold as either to add anything to them, to take anything from them, or to make any change in them." End quote. That's Flavius Josephus against Apion, Book 1, Section 8. This is a quite remarkable statement, since it confirms precisely our own understanding of when the books of the Old Testament were written and when the age of divine inspiration ended, with Malachi, and how the Jews themselves recognized that the Apocrypha, though valuable historically, did not carry divine authority. The books of the Old Testament were seen as consisting of 3 general groups, not the 4 that some of us learned in church. We were told that the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, were the law, that there was a second group of history, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, plus the books of poetry, Proverbs, Psalms, and so forth, and finally, writings of the major and minor prophets. The Jewish grouping began with what they called the Torah, the Pentateuch, our first 5 books, just as we do. But then they classed what we call the history books among the prophets. The Hebrew term is Nevi'im, prophets, and their view was that books such as Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were all penned by prophets. So, why not? They were the former prophets, and the others were the latter prophets. The third group contained all the rest. There were the ones we usually designate as poetry, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, plus Job, Ruth, Esther, and some we would call historical, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. The Jews called all of them Ketuvim, the writings. This threefold grouping of the Old Testament books was standard among the Jews of Jesus' day, and he used it as well. Do you recall that after his resurrection, Jesus reminded his apostles that his mission was all prophesied in Scripture? Quote, he said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Luke 24:44. There they are, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. When we turn to the books of the New Testament, we usually see a list like this, 27 books. There was in fact some uncertainty about that number and which books it involved during the early years of the church. Some of the churches were less familiar with a few of the books, such as 2 Peter and 2 and 3 John, and the church in the West was uncertain about the author of Hebrews. But it was all resolved before long. Two of our oldest and most complete manuscripts testify to this. Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century includes all 27 of our canonical books, plus the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas, no doubt as recommended reading. And Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th century includes the same list of canonical books, plus 1st and 2nd Clement. But these were recommended reading only. A document from about 170 A.D. warns the faithful that, for example, Hermas' work, The Shepherd, should not be treated as canonical. It was written after the age of the apostles. Much more about that later in this series. As for the grouping of the New Testament books, it should be familiar to many. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first three of these are often called synoptics, a term that means seen together, since they have similar structure. John's Gospel stands alone. Then there is Luke's other work, Acts, which chronicles for us the beginnings and the spread of the early church. Then there are the letters of Paul, a dozen of them, or 13 if Hebrews comes from his hand. 4 of his letters are generally called pastoral epistles, since they're written to individuals, Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. And then we note the general epistles. They were not directed to a specific individual or congregation. Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter, the 3 letters of John, James, and Jude. And finally, John's sweeping vision, Revelation. These, then, are the contents of the Old Covenant and New Covenant scriptures. Over the next several sessions, we will examine how these books came to be written, collected, formed into a canon, transmitted, studied and preserved, and translated for the world. It's a fascinating story. I hope you'll stay with us to the end. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in this series, you may address them to me, Dr. Jerry C. Four, at yahoo.com.